All right, so again, just comparing feudal Europe to feudal Japan. Now the notes are printed. Awesome. All right, so uh, first off, both systems lasted hundreds of years. Both systems had no centralized government, so to speak. Yes, there was some sort of ruler at the top of the social pyramid. In Japan, it was an emperor. In Europe, mostly it was a king, right? But ultimately, that's more of a symbolic ruler. In some parts of Europe, really the true leader was the Pope, if they were a very religious society. But ultimately, under a feudal system, the most of the power is in the hands of the nobles, right? So that means that there's much more local rule. So you're less concerned if you're a peasant about who your king is. You're much more concerned about who your lord is. And again, if you're religious, you look to the Pope for spiritual guidance. Um, the daimyo in Japan, they were the land owning aristocrats. I already said that. So they have the supreme power over the land. That is spelled incorrectly. I just noticed. I got that image from the internet. The A comes before the I. So it's daimyo. All right. So in any case, uh, both of these societies, both European and Japanese, feature very little social mobility. You essentially are born and die in the same class. Both are built upon hereditary monarchies, right? So the next ruler, the next head, right, the next emperor king comes from a blood relative. The Japanese social order, the names are slightly different, but they're similar, right? The serfs, that's the name for Japanese peasants, they are born into lives where they are economically dependent on their lords. The samurai are also born into their class, and their role is to protect, right? So they don't actually own land, but they have a very respected lifestyle because of their role as protector. The daimyo, again, they're born into a life of privilege. So the European social order. Peasants also are known oftentimes as serfs, right? It does depend on where you are in Europe. Let's say in Russia, peasants are essentially always called serfs, right? And then the European version of a samurai would be a knight. The European version of a daimyo would be a noble. So you can certainly use the English word. I would definitely mention samurai though, not knight. And ideally, you would be comfortable with using the word daimyo and shogun, right? You definitely need to know shogun in the future. When we talk about the Tokugawa shogunate in a little while, you have to know what a shogun is, okay? So let's just know it for now. Why not? Both these systems have some sort of code of honor, although chivalry and bushido are not exactly the same. And in both systems, of course, the peasants or serfs are the ones who work the land. They're the ones who, as I like to say, are the bread baskets of the entire society. In terms of appearance, they wear different armor. The weapon of choice for a European knight would be a sword. Oftentimes, the knights are also mounted. They ride horses. Whereas the samurai, their choice is it's still a sword, but it's a uniquely Japanese sword, the samurai sword. Very expensive, very valuable, and it takes a long time for the samurai to actually train. In terms of appearance as well, they also dress slightly differently, as we can see here. The Bushido Code. This is the code of honor for the Japanese samurai. So, the Bushido culture ultimately stresses frugality, loyalty, the martial arts, and honor unto death, right? So, we're going to contrast that with chivalry for a second. Uh, is it here? There it is. So the code of chivalry. Oh, blast! I didn't change the font. I hate Comic Sans, but that's okay. We'll survive. So in any case, the medieval code of chivalry arguably is a little bit more complex because there are more parts to it, but ultimately it's similar concepts, slightly different in practice, right? So justice, loyalty, defense, courage, faith, humility, and nobility. I like that faith is included in there. It's not that I like it, but I think it's interesting because that, I would say, is a contrast from the Japanese samurai code, which says nothing about faith or religion in it, although Buddhism is a significant faith for many samurai. One of the major differences between samurai and the nobles is that if a samurai does something to dishonor his daimyo, he is expected to commit suicide, and this is called seppuku. It is Japanese for ritual suicide. Essentially, what the samurai will do is stab himself very painfully in the stomach. There is actually a strategy to how seppuku works, but I will spare you that detail for this video. And then after a samurai commits suicide, the next step is kaishaku, which translates into seconds. As ultimately, what that means is that there's another samurai who stands by, and after seppuku, he decapitates the already dead suicide victim, right? Just to probably, I don't know, is it to ensure that he's dead, or is it to ultimately express that continuation of honor? Maybe it's a little bit of both. In terms of religion, I already said that the Japanese also adopt Buddhism. They get it from China, but they do adopt their own unique form. It's called Zen Buddhism. The other form of Buddhism that we often refer to is Mahayana, and there's also Theravada. We can talk about those when we return to India in a little while. But ultimately, the Zen Buddhism is uniquely Japanese in many ways because it actually adopts Bushido values into its practice. So there's much more of an emphasis on discipline in Zen Buddhism than there is in other forms. The last thing that we need to mention is that towards the end of this feudal period of Japan, there are two different attempts by the Mongols to invade and ultimately raid Japan. The first one took place in 1274 CE, and the second one was in 1281 CE, so pretty close together. Both of these attempts, although they were very large, first off, it's fascinating that the Mongols actually boarded ships, because you tend to think about Mongols as mounted warriors on horseback. But nonetheless, they did, and they sail across the Sea of Japan, and they are unable to successfully make it because both times there are kamikazes, not to be confused with the suicide pilots of World War II. They really sort of adopt a new meaning for kamikaze there. What kamikaze actually means in this context is typhoon. So typhoons are very rough winds. They're comparable to tornadoes, although they're not exactly the same. So the Mongols were not prepared for that harsh weather, and they fail to invade Japan. So the Mongols, as we know, are much more successful in invading and taking over China. So this is the same time that the Mongol Yuan dynasty is established in China, but their attempts to get into Japan do not work. So in any case, that's it for Japan in the feudal era. We'll talk about the Tokugawa shogunate and the fourth period, even though it does actually technically begin in period 3. It just makes more sense to do it that way because for the most part the Tokugawa shogunate is in period 4. All right, so thanks so much for watching, and we will pick up shortly with videos on Korea and Vietnam. So stay tuned.